And people are being brought to Siberia or they felt a danger. So she, with her 5 other siblings, her parents, an aunt and an uncle, they emigrated, they left, and then they ended up in Hanau, a displaced person camp, where she was for 4 years. And she left very young. She left, I think, when she was 13 or 14. She left Lithuania 13 or 14. And in Hanau, for her, she was in theater, she was dancing. She always felt safe. Her whole family was there. And only later on did she, thinking about her mother, Ona, my močiutė, my grandmother, saying that she was depressed and she had a heaviness. But so my mother was with her whole family.
The people who were fleeing from Lithuania, as many of the other people, ended up in displaced person camps, or DP camps. So he and my mother separately, and another, they hadn't met yet, were living in these displaced person camps. And they spent several years there, so much so that in these camps, people developed schools and published books and had theater groups and other things like that. And in fact, the people who were university age were allowed to attend German universities. So my dad continued his studies. He was studying medicine, so he continued his studies. He also met my mom there. They weren't in the same displaced person camp, but they met during one of the socials and got engaged when they were in Germany in the displaced person camps. So he eventually, the way he came to the United States, and the way anyone came to the United States at that time, is they had to be sponsored by somebody. And so my dad ended up in Rochester because he had a distant relative named Blanche Zemnitsky, whose family had come to Rochester a long, long time ago. And so they sponsored my dad, who then brought over my mom. And some of my other relatives also came to Rochester. So that's how they came there and established themselves.
She and my dad left Lithuania in September of 1944, just after they got married. And the main reason for them leaving Lithuania was the fact that my dad had graduated from military academy and would have been drafted in the Soviet Army. So, they fled to Germany and ended up in the part of Germany that got partitioned to the United States in southern Germany, where my brother and I were born, and were sponsored. It was the part that, there were Americans there, and we were sponsored by my father's uncle to come to the United States. She was born in Kalvaria in southern Lithuania. She lived on a small farm. She was the 5th of 7 children, and she went to school in the area school. Her dad was, in addition to being a farmer, was also a small local politician / magistrate. And she was only a teenager. She was 13 when World War II started. And after she finished school in Kalvaria, she went off to Marijampolė to live with an uncle, where she studied accounting and bookkeeping and, carried on her life as a teenager. When she, was in Lithuania, she was, athletic, and she also danced in the area. And then when she came to Germany, there's a picture in Germany. There was a dance group that she belonged to with the DPs that lived in the area. And also, when we lived in Pennsylvania, she formed a small dance group.
I found it amazing with my mother telling me the stories of how people communicated in that time. Like, some families were just one step ahead of missing that train because of the underground communications. And to me, it was fascinating. She was in dental school when she left, and when she got to Germany, they threw her in the operating room, and she goes, "I'm not a nurse, I'm in dental school." They went like basically good enough. And she would tell me stories of when walking down the hallway, the German soldiers would, hi Hitler, and she refused. And one soldier, I suppose, was very kind to her and said, "Do you know how much trouble you can get into by not doing this?" And she said from that day forth, she dove into rooms, broom closets, anywhere, just so she wouldn't have to say, "Oh, hi, Hitler." And also she went to school there, and you know, all the stories, and I'm sure hundreds of Lithuanians have these, of taking the train with a piece of bread with sugar, trying to go to school.
In Germany.
In Germany. She met Winston Churchill, and
She did.
she shook hands with Winston Churchill.
How did that happen?
He was in the hospital. He walked through the hospital to see what was going on. And then, my history isn't 100%, then the regime changed. Then I think the Russians came in, they divided. So now Germany was not a safe place to be any longer. And they had to pay somebody to row them across the river to get on the safe side. And the story is they had to lay on their stomachs because soldiers were shooting. Her regret to the day she died was she never knew what happened to the person that rowed them across.
Was he German?
I don't know. I don't know if he was German or not. And then, you know, being a displaced person, and then finally taking the ship across the Atlantic, getting to the US. Everybody was sick. She contracted tuberculosis on the ship, and when she got to Rochester, she was in the hospital for 2 years and almost died, but always remembered her grandmother saying, if the angel of death is at your feet, you're not going to die. If the angel of death is at your head, you're going to die.
Most displaced persons, DPs, emigrated from Germany to the United States between 1946 and 1950. Their journeys were unique. Almost all eventually succeeded and prospered. Some did not find work in their field of study or occupations in Lithuania. Some of the younger arrivals found romance and a good life.
We as a family came in 1951, and you had to have a guarantee of a job by somebody, a sponsor, and that's how it was with everybody else that came around the Second World War. And most of them ended up in places that Lithuanians already lived. We had a sponsor, a church sponsored us, a whole parish, a Lithuanian, not a Lithuanian, a Lutheran evangelical church. And they said, and then my father said, this is our chance to get to the United States, and we will take it. My father, he had many different jobs in Lithuania as he was young and so forth. But when we went in Germany at that time, he said, I'll get a job that I probably can, I'll get a profession that I might get easier job with. So he said, I'll learn how to be a carpenter, a bricklayer, you know, that kind of thing. And sure enough, they hired him, this little contractor. Now this contractor was in Harrade, South Dakota. I don't know if you have a map, but I know exactly where it is. And it's 8 miles from North Dakota, and it had 600 people only. To us and from Europe, that's unbelievable. That something would be that small and be called a town. That was the biggest town in it was called the Campbell County, I believe. The capital had only 300 people. And that just gives you an imagine about the whole area. Now, to the east of Campbell County was a large Lakota Indian reservation, huge one. South Dakota had many areas, including Rosebud and other places which were attacked. Anyway, that's another story. So we arrived through New York City, eventually by train, 40 miles to the station. That town had maybe around 4,000 people or so, maybe a little bit more. I even remember the name, Mobridge. And we were picked up by the pastor of the parish. And it was the first time I drove in this beautiful Chrysler car. I mean, I didn't drive it. So we ended up in this little town, which was about roughly 40 miles from where we got out of the station by this pastor. And my father had a job. However, and then his boss died within about a year, about a year, or maybe even less, and there was no more job. So, but my experience in South Dakota was amazing, because in the city that we were there, half the people, if they were about 35 years old, the town was was eventually celebrated when I was still there, 100 years. The age was 100 years. But half of them, if they were 30 years, they could still speak a German language. Since they didn't come from Germany, they came from what we call Volga Deutsch. That means they came from Russia near the Volga River. They never learned Russian. The reason they came is because the Tsarina, who was really German, invited Germans, good farmers. So they were farmers, amazing farmers, like many people in Minnesota and so forth, the Swedish and all of them. They're just amazing immigrants. Anyway, so they could still speak some of the German. When I spoke to them in my German, because I had learned this as a child too, they said, "I'm not speaking good German." I said, "You are not speaking good German. I am speaking good German," the way they would have taught in Germany right now. Anyway, so it was a very interesting history. So my father lost his job. So immediately, and my oldest sister start looking for places to live other than Heritage, South Dakota, although I fell in love with that place. And my first job was there too. So he immediately got in contact with Chicago and my oldest sister. He immediately moved with my older sister to Chicago and got a job there. Now I am in South Dakota with my other sister, and me and my mother. And we stayed there during the winter of a South Dakota winter that I'd never experienced in my life before. And we walked to the school. I even froze my nose, my face, just to get to school. And we just lived in one small home. That's all it was. It was about the size of this living room, about that size, maybe even smaller. We had a place my mother could cook that also heated the room. If I left a glass of water by my bed, overnight it would freeze. That's how cold it was. We had no pump outside. We had no well outside. The neighbor allowed us to go to their well, and half the towns and half the homes had water from the pump, and it was good water, excellent water. And that was it. And we stayed that winter, waiting when spring comes so we could then move towards Chicago.
Just tell me the story about living at St. Mary's Hospital.
Well, that was funny. I just remember the big nuns. I mean, not the nuns with the big hats, the Sisters of Charity, the kind that you see, the flying nun. And they were the nuns there. And I just remember they would knock on our door all the time, mad, because we weren't supposed to cook in the room. We were supposed to go to the cafeteria and eat. But we're kids, we're hungry. My brother was there, I was there, and my mother had a little hot plate, and she was very sneaky, and she would make kosh, and she would make the porridge, the farina, or she would make pancakes, the Lithuanian pancakes. She's whipping those out, and all of a sudden the knock on the door, "You're not allowed to cook here." Mom would go, "Oh no, I'm not cooking." And you could just smell the delicious pancakes. So basically that's all I remember about the hospital.
How long did you live there?
I think it was a year or two. He just did his residency, and then he went on to, it was called Iola. Now it's the Monroe Community Hospital. There he did his residency. And I remember we used to go, because he had like a little room there that he would have to, because every other weekend he had to spend the weekend there to be on call, and then he would be there. So we would come on Sundays, we'd take a bus, we'd visit him at the hospital while he was on call, and then we'd go in the back there, the canal was going right along there, we'd all go swimming if it was a beautiful sunny day or something. Or we would, just spend a day with him, we'd go in the cafeteria, have lunch, whatever, and that was basically what we did there.
I don't know much of the politics of to allow World War II refugees to enter America, but Romas Masilionis, who they had met in Dresden, was willing to provide a home to help find him a job. So Vytautas and Martina, through their belief in him, a promise to support them. So after they came over from Germany, and I'm not sure what port they arrived in, but they moved to Buffalo to be with Romas and Aldona Masilione. Initially in Buffalo, he was an elevator operator, and he jokes because all he needed to learn how to say was "up, sir," "down, sir," and I think it was the old Statler Hotel. And he also sang for Christmas parties, and I remember my father saying that he sang Silent Night and Christmas carols for special events. And I don't know how he chose it, but he went to optician school in Buffalo, and he studied to be an optician, and that's what promoted or prompted his move to Rochester to work for Bausch & Lomb. So then my mother moved to Worcester, and they had a triplex house where one sister lived on the top, an aunt and uncle lived in the middle, and my mother with her parents lived in the bottom. And then she spent almost 10 years in Worcester before she came to Brooklyn and met her future husband, and then she moved to Rochester. She was very beautiful as a young girl, as a teenager, and in Worcester, she had the opportunity to be in an acting troupe and met Henrikas Kačinskas, a very prestigious theater director, and that's where she began her passion for acting. And both in Worcester, she was an actress, and in Rochester, I think the community and her biggest contribution was being an actress and helping produce theatrical performances.
His first job here was pounding railroad spikes. And that, to me, was, it's amazing, what people did. They have to have a life in that respect. You do what you had to do. I said my father was a teacher, or was highly ranked in the service and everything else, and that's the only job you have when you first get here. You did it. Simple as that.
And how, as he progressed in his life here, what?
Well, then he worked in a manufacturing plant. I remember when I was older, I used to drive him to work, and I could use the car during the day and then pick him up after work. And then he went back to school to the University of Rochester. And from what I understand, in 3 years, working a full-time job, in 3 years, he graduated 100% of a percentage point from being summa cum laude to U of R. And then he was a teacher of Russian and German at East Arundecoit High School.
My mother and father were Vlada and Antanas Sabalauskas, but when they came to this country, they shortened it, like a lot of people did, to Sabalas.
And tell us a little bit about your parents. What significant role they played in the Lithuanian Rochester community?
Well, my parents, like a lot of Lithuanians during the late 40s, early 50s, emigrated to the United States to escape, the takeover, the Russian communist takeover of Lithuania at that time. And I was born in a displaced persons camp, a Lithuanian stovykla, where I was born, and in 1948. And at that time, my mother was able to come first. Kunigas Basksys, Father Basksys, was sponsoring people. You had to be sponsored in those days, I guess, to come to the United States. And she came over by herself with me first because my father had TB and had to be kept in a hospital before he was allowed to enter the country. So he came about a year later. And so my mother had been a trained musician, opera singer, a soprano back in Vilnius. She made her debut at that time on the stage before the war. And she also had 2 PhDs, one in linguistics and one in music. So when she came to Rochester, she came under the sponsorship of Kunigas Basksys, who also helped her get a placement as a professor at Nazareth College of Rochester, where she taught for over 30 years before she retired. My father, along with my uncle Kazimieras and his wife Kotrina Sabalas, they came together to Rochester, and both my father and my uncle Kazis were lawyers in Lithuania, and my father was also a judge. He was a judge in the stovykla as well. So when things came up with people, I guess my father would hold like a little court and decisions would be made. Unfortunately, neither one of them, Kazis nor my father Antanas, could practice law in this country because my father was already in his 40s. He didn't speak English, and and also law in this country, or law in Europe, is the Napoleonic Code, where you're guilty and then proved innocent, whereas here in this country you're innocent and then proved guilty. So he would have had to go to school all over again, which of course at his age and not speaking the language he wasn't able to do. It was difficult for him to get a position in Rochester at first because he had TB. So, whenever anybody did an x-ray, they could see that one of his lungs had been damaged. But he eventually did get a job working at a public elementary school as a janitor, as a maintenance man, which he did all of the rest of his life before he retired as well. So and my uncle Kazis went to work at Delco, a factory, which a lot of these intellectuals and educated people like my parents were, at the time, they just took whatever they could get to survive.
Father Basksys was pastor at St. George's Parish in Rochester, New York from 1930 to 1956. He was born in Salovarte in Alytus County, Lithuania. In 1913, he emigrated to the United States and began his theological studies at St. Bernard Seminary and was ordained in 1920. Through his efforts and parishioners' support, a parochial school was established and a new church and convent built. He was a supporter of Lithuanian causes and helped many Lithuanians start a new life in Rochester.
Father Basksys married us, So after that, we went down in a hall, in a hall, there was a lot of people. And then we'll sit down eating, and then when people start talking, and congratulate, stuff like that. So Father Basksys get up, and he says, well, you're not going to believe it, but my daughter is getting married. Because he was my sponsor. That's what he said, So
how did that make you feel?
I don't know, just funny, just laugh. Everybody just laughed, He was.
What was Father Basksys like? What type of person?
He was very nice, friendly person. He was my sponsor before, he found a place where to live in Rochester. I can come over, So he was my sponsor. That's why he says I was his daughter.
Did he sponsor many people that you're aware of?
He did some. I don't know how many, but I know he did.
He had his farm, his animals, his equipment, whatever he needed. He had his 2 people to help him work the farm, because I guess back then with 119 acres, you had to have people helping you. They didn't have mechanized stuff like we do now. So he had his farm, he had his workers, he was ready to go, but he didn't have a wife. So he got back on the train and came back to Rochester and went to St. George's and said, I need a wife. This is all oral history. I don't know that it's true. I don't know that any of this is true. I do have the dates and the censuses, but yes, my father told me that he got back on the train, came back into Rochester and said, I need a wife. And somehow or other they found him a wife. Yes, it was Father Basksys that was there and found him a wife, married them, and then they got back on the train and went back to the farm. And that's the story my father told me. My grandmother never really told me anything about it, and they didn't talk about anything. Now I know that my 2 grandmas would sit in the backyard hooking rugs and doing all kinds of needlework all the time and talking in Lithuanian under the tree in the summer, but I don't know anything that they were talking about. And I don't really know any of the other stories, but when my father was 90 years old, I did take him, we went all around out here in the farm area, and he told me about growing up and what happened and what, and whatever. So this is all this is coming from, and the tales that I heard growing up. How my grandmother got here from Lithuania, I don't really know. She was orphaned at age 10, I do know that. And my father said that the church had sent her to work for a Polish nobleman at his manor house in the area. But between being 10 years old and orphaned and her getting to St. George's Church, I do not know what that was, and I would dearly love to know all about that. And apparently, I think my father said, I think that she was cleaning the church, and then they got married and went back to Waterport. And that's all I know about that. Yes, and then they did have 2 sons. One later died. Father Basksys apparently, my father said he was his godfather. Now I don't know how that works either. That again is oral history. But all the time when my father was growing up, every summer, Father and the housekeeper would come up for a week, would come out to Waterport to spend a week on the farm. And at first they came by train, and then they got a car, and he would come out in his car, and they would spend their week vacation on the farm, and they would go back with a car loaded full of, I don't know what, chickens and peaches and pears or whatever else, that they were growing.
Well, I went through St. George's over there, and Father Basksys used to have a strap that used to come into the building with it, kind of threaten us, you got to be good. Yeah. We were all afraid of him because he was a lot older than us. We were just little kids. And he was the boss. And nuns appreciated him being there. But it was nice having a young priest like Father Baluk come in there. Father Kavicius, that was his name. They had to change it to Baluk.
I remember my mother would always invite Kunigas Basksys over for dinner every so often, and he loved to smoke cigars. So he would come for dinner, and after dinner he would smoke his big cigar, and my mother would be like grinding her teeth, and after he left she'd open all the windows and doors, and so that's what I remember about Kudnagus Basksys.
Who was the priest when you went to school there?
Well, okay, it was in Father Basksys, and he was there for a long time, and Father was a big, tall man, and towering over everybody, but he was very kind and gentle. And as a preacher, he was really the best. I mean, he had people in tears, he really did. And in those days, when he got through, you were practically on your knees begging for forgiveness, you know. And but a very powerful speaker.